It's now my pleasure to welcome Deborah Cavarino, who's going to give us a lecture on the birth of opera this evening. Deborah is based in Florence and is here when she can be, but because she's a highly successful working conductor and musician, she's traveling a lot, even during times of COVID. Currently, she's rehearsing at the Maggio Musicale with Maestro Metta, getting ready for the opera season, which they hope to run in the spring. She was born in South Africa, spent formative and training years in Los Angeles, and has been to Florence initially on a Fulbright's program once earlier on, and then once again more recently. And as I say, is now resident in Florence when she's not traveling around the world, as one of the most successful emerging female conductors on the scene, because there are not very, very few women who are allowed to take up the baton and run the big orchestras. So with that introduction, I'm going to hand you over to Deborah, who will now deliver her lecture. Deborah, over to you.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you for Simon. Thank you to the British Institute of Florence for allowing me to share my greatest passion with all of you, music. Now,
the story of opera is unique to the history of music, because unlike the origins of song and instrumental music and dance, which are lost in the mists of time, for opera we can actually identify the precise moment when it was invented. Most of us know that opera was born in Italy. However, how many of you could tell me precisely when and where it was born? As you may already know, most of the musical forms, harmonic language, musical notation, and the instruments we still use today were all developed on the Italian peninsula. Music has always been linked to our development as a species. It cultivates a very unique, multifaceted aspect that makes it truly unique among the arts. It orbits around varying spheres of human existence, the arts and the sciences. Between mathematics, physics, psychology, sociology, and biology, as well as semiotics, philosophy, expression, and creativity. Opera was born in Florence in the late 1500s in the High Renaissance, and it was the child of two very different parents. On the one hand, there were the courtly spectacles, which included a plethora of opera's predecessors: masques, pastorals, intermedi, ballate, sometimes even equestrian, madrigale comiche. These elaborate musical entertainments were often performed on special occasions, weddings, the victory triumphs of Lorenzo de' Medici and Cosimo I. They were a melange of entertainments, parades, musical balletic extravaganzas, often based on classical allegory, and they focused representatively on the monarch and the court, with some monarchs even participating at some point in the performance for the concluding dance or song. Opera's other parent was a very different figure indeed. But before we get to that, we need to set up the musical landscape leading to opera's conception. A group of Italian literary scholars in Florence were determined to revive what they believed was the unmatched emotional power of ancient Greek drama. On the one hand, this idea of fantastic spectacles, lavish sets and costumes, virtuosic singing, fantastical machinery, ever more theatrical orchestra playing and dancing. But on the other side, this very different idea of the perfect and sincere recreation of classical drama. These two aspects of opera's personality to some extent in tension and rivalry for the whole 4 centuries of its history is also one of the reasons opera is so enduring and successful as a genre. But our story begins in the last decade of the 16th century in Florence. Now, before we meet these scholars, we need to take a moment to picture the cultural world that they were growing up in and consider the musical landscape from which they were drawing inspiration and reacting. One of the things that carried on through the Roman period was the memorization of what was likely a Carolingian synthesis of Roman and Gallican chants through a purely oral tradition known as Plainchant. Plainchant has a monophonic texture consisting of a single, unaccompanied melodic line sung in unison and was not composed in keys, but in a unique modal system of whole and half steps. Music was taught without a fixed meter or rhythm. It is highly effective for underlying a sacred text, a text that would become ever increasingly canonized with the development of Christianity. Though they had the words written down in a unified language, Latin, the monks had to keep in their head all the music, which meant that every note of every chant had to be taught by mimicker. We are talking about something close to 80 hours of music, memorizing a couple thousand chants. A monumental feat indeed. Listen to how this monophonic texture beautifully underlies the sacred Easter chant, Victime Paschale Laudes.
Victime Paschali Laudes, immolem Christiani, Aius redemit Opes Christus innocens Patri, reconciliavit peccatores, mors et vita duello conflixere mirando, dux ite mortus regnat vivus.
With the invention of staff notation and his use of chironomy, or hand signal techniques, to teach and remember the notes using mnemonic solemnization, the Benedict choir master Guido d'Arezzo in circa 1020 created what can be considered as music's first big bang. Eventually, this would give future musicians the tools not only to create more and more complex music, it also created a language by which, with a little training, the music could be performed without the dependence on the memory of one particular individual, but it could be read and understood by others. Now, monophonic music could expand into much more complex forms of music. First, a second voice was added called organum, and then a third and fourth voice to the now homophonic chants, ultimately led to an ever-building sophistication until music had become polyphonic in texture, as is found in the Ars Antiqua of the 13th century, exemplified by the Notre Dame polyphony, and in the Italian Trecento with Landini and Josquin Dupré. Polyphonic music was conceptualized as multiple independent layers of melodies all at the same time, or the same melody started at different intervals. One voice starts the melody and successively another voice is continuously added until 5 or 6 voices are all singing separate lines simultaneously. By the 15th and early 16th centuries, composers continued to play with polyphony until here, music had become the master, eventually obscuring ever more the text. The 16th century had seen polyphony reach astonishing heights of artistry, whether it was for sacred motets and hymns or for secular madrigals. In these polyphonic examples, we can marvel at the artistry of the interwoven music. But can you make out the text they are singing? The music we are about to survey transfigures out within and in a way is a response to the High Renaissance. Music back then, and admittedly still today, is often missing among the bright constellation of Renaissance masters here in Florence, between the arts, literature, architecture, and science. Music had remained in the grandiose polyphonic stile antico, as it would later become known, inherited from the previous century. Even after the Counter-Reformation and subsequent Council of Trent, musicians had only sought to perfect polyphonic music, as exemplified by the glorious counterpoint of Palestrina, Byrd, Tallis, Lassus, and Victoria. In this style, all the vocal parts were conceptualized with roughly equal importance, and they weaved around each other to a marvelous overall effect, but with no voice predominating. And most importantly, there was no innovation. The Renaissance reflection, re-evaluation, and reawakening that had already permeated through the sister arts had yet to reach music. However, a new style was about to emerge. At the apex of this musical expression, some composers began to feel the shortcomings of this style in expressing emotion, and this is partly what would lead them towards developing a new style that Giulio Caccini called the stile moderno, or le nuove musiche, and what Claudio Monteverdi would come to call the seconda pratica, the new style. By jettisoning much of the complexity of the multiple parts and introducing a bass line that was separate from the voices, these composers could make a single melodic line or duetting pair predominate, supported by a more vertical conception of the harmonies that sought to match the text with the melody, infusing individual words with emotional color and sentiment that they deemed was no longer viable in a complicated multi-voice texture. Composers began to employ the tension and relaxation of their treatment of consonances and dissonances in line with the harmonic mean, the harmonic series, as it helped to mirror the tension and release used in the phrasing of storytelling. This resulted in what we now call monody, a single voice over a bass line with supporting harmonies. One of the leading singers and composers of this new style was Giulio Caccini. His monodic textures help us to once again hear clearly the text in balance with the music. This new style of monody, of solo singing, was of enormous interest to a group of humanist scholars, mathematicians, musicians, poets, and intellectuals who decided to gather to find a solution to the pressing problem of the day: how to reanimate music and drama so they could exemplify the innovations seen in the other sister arts. But before I get to the why the Camerata de' Bardi began to meet and what they were intending to resolve, I would just like to spend 2 minutes on the why Florence. Fluorescence of artistic genius, vitality, and versatility in the Renaissance and Baroque Italy profoundly shaped the course of Western civilization. Art, architecture, literature, science, philosophy, and later music converged in a time and space beginning in the late 1300s with writers and thinkers such as Petrarca, Boccaccio, and Dante. During this period, Florence is one of the pearls. It was already establishing itself as an important seat of artistic, humanistic, technological, and scientific flowering. The discovery of neoclassical treatises, together with the invention of printing, the creation of libraries which helped make resources more widely available and disseminated, the surge of vernacular literature making a conscientious effort to connect with its audiences, the influx into Florence of Greek-speaking populations and the Byzantine influence during the 6 months of the Florence Council, together with the unique position of the Florentine families who were already banks to large parts of the continent, Bardi, Peruzzi, not to mention the Medici. All of this created a unique, fertile ground that we would come to know as the Renaissance. The very intersections of thought and culture may have paved the way to more intellectual freedom and individual expression. As a result, tremendous innovations are made in the fields of mathematics, medicine, engineering, architecture, and the visual arts. As is so very often the case, many of these art forms start from a more subtle awakening in philosophy, which begins to influence and permeate throughout socioeconomic and cultural circles, until a new style and a new epoch is born. The hallmark of Petrarch's thought was a deep consciousness of the past as a nutriment of the present. This idea had already been permeating in the visual arts and architecture. Renaissance artists such as Giotto had discovered the concept of perspective in their paintings, while Italian architect Filippo Brunelleschi aimed to demonstrate its principles, and the writings of Leon Battista Alberti, who wrote about the perspective in his Di Pictura of 1435. After Brunelleschi and Alberti's studies, almost every artist in Florence and Italy tried to represent three-dimensional objects using the geometric perspective in their paintings. From Donatello to Perugino and the great masters of the High Renaissance, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raffaello, and Piero della Francesca. Now it was time for music to reflect and reevaluate its place among the Renaissance arts. So, this new style of solo singing known as monody, which employed a single melodic line over a basso continuo, usually realized by an instrument, was of enormous interest to a group of scholars dominated by poet Girolamo May and the music theorist Vincenzo Galilei, who for interest was the father of the astronomer. These men gathered under the patronage of Count Giovanni de' Bardi in his palazzo, originally designed by Brunelleschi, to discuss the trends in the arts and how to innovate music and drama. They specifically wanted to address their concerns with the overuse of polyphony at the expense of the sung text's intelligibility. And more importantly, this meant that music no longer had the power to move the affections. At a time when brimming intellectual academies begin to spring up, such as the Accademia della Crusca, Accademia delle Alte Arti, and many others, our group called themselves the Camerata dei Bardi, also known as the Florentine Camerata. It may have been a play on words, camerata, as in friends, a meeting among friends. Or it may have even referred to the very room where these friends met, Bardi's Camerata, where they discussed and even performed musical experiments for one another. For my film aficionados out there, it was essentially Florence's first Amici Miei. Today, it is an exclusive apartment of over 300 square meters, and it is one of Florence's most enthralling places to stay. It was extremely exciting when I received a call from my dear friends who had just bought the palazzo. It was even more exciting to discover that the Camerata was indeed carrying out their musical experiments there. In the high wooden ceilings, you can still see intact the scaffolding and machinery where they were likely setting up scenery for their experiments. Bardi invited other brilliant minds of the day, such as Giulio Caccini, who was already recognized as one of the pioneers in singing and composing of monody, along with other musicians, to participate in the philosophical discussion and see if they could put their ideas into practice. Their research into ancient Greek theater and music produced some remarkable conclusions. Approaching these texts for the first time, many of these works had remained obscure since antiquity, partly due to the lack of access and partly due to the loss of Greek. But now many works had resurfaced, also in grand part due to the invention of the printing press. Unifying the Camerata members was the belief that music was lagging behind the other arts and sciences and needed innovation. Unifying the Camerata members was the belief that music was lagging behind the other arts and sciences and needed innovation. Moreover, they concluded that ancient music must have derived this phenomenal power from monody, where every single word could be given clear emotional meaning by its pitch, its duration, and by its supporting harmonies. It was impossible, they concluded, that multi-voice counterpoint could ever have had this direct, raw, emotional power. It was agreed that Greek myths, and particularly Greek tragedy from the oral traditions, or archaic epics exploring the themes around human nature, were ideal candidates with which to experiment. True to their universal nature, archetypal characters and stories about our human imperfections, ambitions, victories and losses was something they agreed with which every human being could connect, regardless his or her education and social standing. It was a way of bringing the audience into the play. Once they had decided on the overall philosophy of how to remedy the music, and since the story was set, so to speak, the Camerata could focus on how to construct the poetry and music in a perfect balance, so that the listener could enjoy the beauty of the poetry and the music while allowing the music to affect the emotional nuances of the story. Over the next decade, through a series of consecutive musical experiments, which we now have proof they also executed in the big room in Bardi's Palazzo, together with a series of formal events, they aimed to reanimate the power of the music to affect the emotions of the listener. Monody would serve for the music which best highlighted the affections of the character in a particular moment of the drama, and stile recitativo, a recitar cantando, would serve to move the story along. Contemporarily, and thanks to new scholarly perspective which has begun to reinsert the Concerto delle Donne, La Musica Segreto, and composers among the Renaissance triangle and their contributions to the development and formation of this new style, we are now able to piece together a more complete idea of opera's birth. As wealthy city-states vied and competed for the most impressive merce, the Concerto delle Donne quickly became renowned for their technical and artistic virtuosity. Word of the priceless Estense jewel spread across Italy, inspiring imitations in various powerful courts. In 1584, responding to requests from Francesco I, Finally, in 1601, after more than a decade of musical experiments, Giulio Caccini published the first treatise on the new music formulated during the Camerata years. So the stage was then set, but as for the first opera and who gets credit, the musicological evidence is not so straightforward. One of the unexpected outcomes of looking to the past to nurture the present not only created an electric feeling in the air that something new was forming, but also a keen sense of legacy that whoever was the first to complete a work, have it performed entirely, and publish it, may be worthy of the merits of being the inventor of this new music. Very much analogous to the race to harness electricity, or even the race to the moon, Caccini, Peri, and to a lesser extent Cavalieri all claimed that he was indeed the progenitor of this marvelous invention of dramas in music and of the recitative style. However, to not get too much into the details now of the Caccini-Peri debate, one point that is undisputed was that Caccini's daughter Francesca, La Cecchina as she was affectionately known, made her debut singing in the Euridice and in Il Rapimento di Cefalo, and her phenomenal vocal playing abilities were just the beginning. For those of you who would like to endeavor more into this topic, there are many interesting studies that do side-by-side analysis of both Peri's and Caccini's Euridice, but we will not have time to get into that this evening. However, let you listen to one of the versions. This is Peri's Funeste Piagge from Euridice. What was so innovative? You see, the objective was now to create a drama through music. In other words, the story would be told only through singing. You cannot have lovely arias and duets and choruses the whole time. You have to be able to say the more mundane things and to be able to move the story along. However, making the transition between speech to song and back to speech again can come across as disjuncted and awkward. But if you were able to write the whole thing so it is sung, it gives you a stylistic unity and cohesion. This then would be followed by an aria wherein the composer can allow Orfeo to emote, thereby moving the affections of the listener. Worthy though these attempts were, both operas had a luke reception at best. They were criticized as being unbalanced, unconvincing, and tedious. Opera would have been dead in the water if it were not for two guests at the wedding. What opera needed now was a composer of intuitive genius to bring it to life with an undisputed masterpiece. The husband of Eleonore Medici, the Duke of Mantua, Vincenzo Gonzaga, was intrigued, and he asked his poet Strigio, son of Camerato Strigio by the same name, to adapt the libretto as an entertainment for his court. His maestro di capello was asked to supply the music, and since 1601, that post had been held by none other than the Cremonese Claudio Monteverdi. Monteverdi had already begun to show his musical proliferation at the Gonzaga court, and by now had already produced 5 of his 9 madrigal books. I have been under the spell of his music ever since I was first introduced to it by my composition teacher, Erica Moll, who herself is an accomplished composer who studied with the formidable Nadia Boulanger. Il Divino Claudio, as he was lauded by the Italian nationalist poet Gabriele D'Annunzio in his novel Il Fuoco. It was through Monteverdi's fantastically colorful and witty madrigals, and his extraordinary operas that I was introduced to a unifying thread of music fabric, which eventually brought me to discover Francesca Caccini and others, such as Maddalena Casolana, Vittoria Raffaele Aleotti, Isabella Leonarda, who were prolific composers and who were, in many cases, conducting their own works. At a very important moment in my musical formation, they served as inspirations for me to continue pursuing my dream of becoming a conductor. One of the champions of Monteverdi, conductor Elliot Gardiner, when asked, "What is so special about his music?" summed it up best. To me, it's humanity, the way Monteverdi manages to get right under our skin and capture our many moods: love, anger, tenderness, regret, remorse. They are all there in his music. It is colorful, it's exciting, and it's always dramatic. Psychologically astute and incredibly clever, no matter if he is composing for the church, a princely son, or the theater. Monteverdi's music simply pulsates with life and truthfulness, and it is fueled by his conviction that music, like a painting, should hold up a mirror to nature. In 1607, Monteverdi wrote Orfeo. Strigio expanded Rinuccini's original libretto, giving more varied poetic structures in the recitatives, but also providing space for choruses, dance, and instrumental sections. Now, immediately we can see the tension between opera's two parents, between the idea of pure recitative on the one hand and spectacle and dance on the other. But in Monteverdi's hands, this did not feel like a compromise. He was able to strike a balance that deepened the characterization and added a level of real color to the drama. Orfeo amounts to a humanist manifesto. He called it a true prayer. Its sentiment was that music, arts, and literature could have a genuine positive effect, and by creating beauty, mankind for a moment could touch divine perfection. What better metaphor for this was the story of a man heartbroken by the death of his beloved, who uses music to move the affections of the guardians of hell. Although it was not the first opera, their Orfeo in 1607 became what is widely believed the first convincing, cohesive realization of what could be attributed as the Big Bang in music, and opera was born. I wholeheartedly agree with the conductor Gardner that Monteverdi was a powerful component in a constellation of some very influential thinkers of his day. Monteverdi was a pioneering craftsman which forever changed the trajectory of music. He stood shoulder to shoulder with his contemporaries from science, literature, and the visual arts: Shakespeare, Caravaggio, Rubens, Kepler, and probably most famous of them all, Galileo. With the successful execution of Monteverdi's second opera, L'Arianna, based on Adrine on Naxos, composed in 1608 for a wedding festivity at the Gazanga court, we have one of opera's first true heroines. Listen to see if you can hear the incredible nuances in this beautiful rendition, sung here with amazing truth and beauty of expression by Anne-Sophie von Otter. Unfortunately, only La Lamento d'Ariana survives complete, but already in its day it became well known beyond the walls of Mantua. The idea of an all-sung musical drama was beginning to take root. Just as if the suave and suggestive breeze of the western wind had carried it, opera began to blossom all over Italy. The perennial rivalry between the Italian city-states almost guaranteed opera's diffusion throughout the peninsula over the next 30 years. Almost immediately, every prince and prelate wanted to sponsor performances. Rome quickly became the center of operatic activity, with rival popes helping things along. The range of plots quickly expanded beyond classical myths to include sacred themes, medieval poems, legends. Opera took root in Rome in the 1620s. In the music of Roman operas, the separation of solo singing into two clearly defined types, recitative and aria, became more marked than ever. The recitative, dissonances, and new musical effects created a more expressive, melodious vocal line, often with regular phrases and triple meter. Music started to become more important than the words, and some melodic sections with recognizable melodic form evolved from the recitative. So we can see that almost immediately the noble ideas of a pure drama expressed through recitative began to suffer. The constant search for novelty meant that arias quickly became distinct from the dialogue around them, showier, ever more extravagant, while plots became more convoluted with ever more extravagant incident. Just like its signature Basilica San Marco, the Venetian Republic was dazzlingly multicultural and extraordinarily dynamic, and its public was just as eager to hear and experience this new music phenomenon. The first public theater, San Casiano, opened in 1637. Formed by a company of just 6 singers and 12 instrumentalists, it had to operate under the much fiercer dictates of the open market, and without a royal patron to sponsor it, it had to appeal to the popular tastes on a very limited budget. Moreover, being born in this fiercely proud republic that was dominated by obscenely rich noble families, and due to its enormous affluence, opposition and rivalry between different aristocratic families immediately rose, and 3 more theaters were quickly opened, each sponsored by different groups. 25 years earlier, Monteverdi had left Mantua to become Maestro di Capella of the Basilico San Marco. By then, the composer, already 73, had acquired considerable prestige in Venice. Due to the popularity of the first operas in Venice, this led to more theaters converting their facilities for opera. The Teatro San Moisè reopened as an opera house during the 1639-40 Carnival, and they had persuaded Monteverdi to revive his opera L'Arianna, which he had originally written in 1608. The success of this revival inspired Monteverdi to write once again for the public stage. Limited by commercial budgets, there could be no question of spectacular choruses, of dancing, of lavish orchestral effects. Perhaps as a result of sheer financial necessity, Monteverdi was forced back to those original ideas of the Florentine Camerata. In a final trio of masterpieces whose gorgeously modulated speech song focus on drama and character, and adherence to classical ideals. He brought the creative wheel full circle back to those founding principles. Unfortunately for us, the marriage of Aeneas and Lavinia is now lost. But of that final trio of masterpieces, the return of Ulysses and the coronation of Poppaea remain the crowning glories of the first half-century of opera. Hearing this deeply moving adia with gorgeous sentiment brings me to a moment of reflection tonight, sharing this powerful music together with you on our individual and collective lockdowns. Monteverdi himself underwent a lockdown and self-isolation for a whole year and a half when he was 63. That is when the plague hit Venice in 1630, carrying off an estimated 50,000 souls, a third of the city's population. Monteverdi was extremely lucky, as were his two sons, to escape the plague, and I cannot help but feel as if a string has been struck in the fabric of time, and here and now in some way we are all connected in our own humanity. Later, however, Naples would become the center of opera in Italy. Meanwhile, opera was spreading from Italy to other parts of Europe. By 1700, Vienna, Paris, Hamburg, and London were also operatic centers. The first Italian opera that we know that was performed outside Italy was Francesca Caccini's La Liberacione di Rugero, Dalisola, Talcina, commissioned by the Regent Archduchess Maria Maddalena of Austria, wife of Cosimo II de' Medici. It is a comic opera in 4 scenes and was performed in February 1625 at the Villa di Poggio Imperiale, here in Florence. And it's based on Ludovico Ariosto's Orlando Furioso. It was performed to celebrate the visit of Prince Władysław of Poland during the Carnival of 1625 in Florence, and he adamantly requested it revived in Warsaw in 1628, making this opera not only the first opera written by a woman, but it has long been acknowledged as the first Italian opera to be performed outside of Italy. Now we know that Caccini had let the Parisians savor the sounds and delights of the new music in 1604 and 05. But it was another Florentine who would eventually bring opera to France. A very different approach developed on the northern continent as it came into contact with native traditions. In France, there was already this flourishing genre of court masques, vierlets, ballet de coeur, and other formes fixes, and so when Giovanni Battista Lulli arrived in France, he realized that his Italian training and the Italian tradition that he had grown up with would need a substantial amount of adaptation to appeal to French tastes. He reinvented himself, possibly even fictionalizing a more noble background, and gallicized his name to Jean-Baptiste Lully. but more importantly, he Gallicized his musical style. He adapted this idea of stile recitative to the declination and inflection of the French language, creating something slower, more melodic, more dignified, more stately, more suited to the elevated mythological stories that glorified the monarch and in which the vocal lines do not obscure the text, but rather support it. He also had at his back an incredibly decadently resourced court. As court composer to Louis XIV, his recitatives and arias merge into one another. He shortened long, complex arias to simple airs. Ballet played a major part in French opera, as would the reinsertion of choruses. Some of his most popular works are his passacaglias and chaconnes, such as those found in Armide et Feuilleton. He expanded the orchestra to have 5-part string textures, together with a more expanded use of wind instruments, gave a much more elaborate sound to the developing Baroque orchestra. Lully also established a form of opera prelude, the French ouverture, consisting of a slow introduction in dotted rhythm, followed by a fast fugal allegro, which, in an evening of varied entertainments, served to announce the beginning of the opera. With Lully, the point of departure was the text, in most cases by the verse dramatiste Philippe Quinault, and a noted collaboration with Molière, and in this sense, he remains faithful to the foundations idealized by the Camerata. Notwithstanding, French opera had taken on a life of its own, which will have long-lasting effects in the still burgeoning genre for centuries to come. England is no stranger to the theatre, and there was as rich and prolific production of music as the famed theatre works from the great Elizabethan era, with the works of William Byrd, John Downland, Thomas Morley, and Thomas Welks. Music here too played an extremely essential role in the aristocratic and sacred spheres. The mass tradition had also been established in England under James I, but had been effectively ended by the Civil War and subsequent Protectorate, during which time the theatres were closed by the Puritan government. This actually allowed for a decade of really quite interesting experimentation in aristocratic houses behind closed doors, as various composers attempted to adapt this idea of all-sung drama to English musical styles and English musical tastes. But with the return of Charles II and the Restoration in 1660, the tastes at court certainly looked again to France. But in London, that was only ever half the story, because the royal family still did not have their own court theatre, and so opera developed in its own way, and a very idiosyncratic way, on the commercial stages of the West End. Theatre-going Londoners had very little time with the idea of all-sung drama. They found the idea of recitative to be irrational and pretentious. Dialogue should be dialogue, song should be song. And in this period, the great operas remain in their own tradition where the dialogue is spoken. The musical interpolations are in some way justified by the plot as music. They're either mythological or magical, something otherworldly, to justify the transition from dialogue to music. It was not until Henry Purcell, writing in circa 1689 with texts by Dryden and adaptations from Shakespeare, we have some wonderful examples of this very individual genre of English opera.
Come if you dare a trumpet sound, come if you dare the foe's rebound. We come, we come, we come, we come, says the double, double, double beat of the thundering drum. Come if you dare the trumpet sound, come if you dare the foe's rebound. We come, we come, we come, we come, says the double, double, double beat of the thundering drum.
Purcell wonderfully interwove the Italian and French stylistic elements to create a uniquely English form of Baroque opera. From the composition of his chamber opera Dido and Aeneas, based on Virgil's epic The Aeneid, we have one of his most famous arias, When I Am Laid in Earth, known as Dido's Lament, formed on a lamento ground bass and is one of the most evoking pieces ever written. Unfortunately, that tradition was not to survive the subsequent Italian invasion, as it were, as the new art form spread infectiously through Germany toward the Channel, and eventually taking London itself, with young aristocrats bringing tales of Italian opera back from their grand tours. Meanwhile, in Italy, Monteverdi's legacy was taken up in Venice by his pupil Francesco Cavalli. He established himself firmly with the success of his 15th opera, Giasone, in 1649, which premiered at Teatro San Casiano. In a series of largely mythological tales, he used fluid, undulating arias that began to separate much more clearly into recitative and aria, which was mirrored by the emergence of set poetical and musical structures in the poetic forms that underpin the arias. In Venice, especially the libretti and plots, with an added grotesque humor, increasingly became subordinated to the music. Composers reveled in its capacity for the sensuous, the exotic, and the erotic. Let's listen to Edimione's aria, which he sings to his virgin goddess, containing the famous antiphon to the Virgin Mary, Salve Regina. Meanwhile, in Naples, a very different tradition began to develop, dominated by the Sicilian-born Alessandro Scarlatti. It was much more serious-minded. It drew a very clear distinction between recitative and aria, and it prized elegance, beauty, and vocal brilliance above the drama. This was the tradition that was shortly about to take Europe by storm, as Italian and Italian-trained musicians spread across the continent, taking positions in the great aristocratic and royal courts. The Venetian Antonio Sortorio to Hanover, the Tuscan Alessandro Stradella to Rome and Venice, Cremonese Benedetto Pallavicino to Mantua and Dresden, and most influentially Steffani to Munich and Hanover. Very soon, no royal court was complete without an Italian or at least Italian-trained composer, and it was through this generation, and Steffani in particular, a castrato himself, that the form of the da capo aria finally took shape and the possibility of the opera as a vehicle for a star singer. That age, dominated by Italian-trained George Friedrich Handel and Giovanni Battista Pergolesi, will be the subject of my next talk, so I hope to see you then. But as for our beloved Florence, the noble traces of a Florence that once was can still be found, se cerca, trova. Even the current mayor studied music and violin. Perhaps it is the moment to bring back music to its rightful place in the Renaissance constellation here in Florence. Music does thrive here, and there is plenty to come see and experience. Maggio Musicale, one of Europe's oldest still working festivals. Orchestra della Toscana, Festival a Fiesole. You could come and listen to Jonathan Berger's Leonardo in the Giardino di Boboli, the Corsina Gardens, or in the Cortile of the Bargello. You could see the ancient Roman amphitheater still intact under the Palazzo Vecchio, not to mention go and hear young up-and-coming artists in the outdoor festivals of Lago di Puccini, Spoleto, and the Arena di Verona, just to mention a few. Wouldn't it be inspirational if Florence could do the utmost to embrace its important role in the birth of one of the most powerful human art forms ever created, opera? The light that was lit so long ago still burns to this day, and I invite all of you to come and feel and experience its warmth. Wouldn't it be so inspirational if Florence could do the utmost to come and experience its warmth?
Okay.
Thank you very much indeed, Deborah. And I'll start my video. So there we have it, everybody. A fascinating introduction to the origins of opera here in Florence. And I think we've got time for some questions, comments, thoughts from everybody. And there's, as usual, we have two ways of doing it. If you want to just be in vivo, please, everybody, put your videos on now. Just unmute yourself and say something and ask Deborah a question. Or if you prefer, you can post it up on the chat and I'll read it out on your behalf. So has anyone got anything they would like to raise?
I just saw one question. Somebody was asking about the pergola. The pergola, I don't have the exact year, but it was much later than the theater in Venice. It was in the 1650s, more or less. And it was specifically made for opera, although Florence was using other venues. They were using Poggio Imperiale, they were using Palazzo Vecchio and all the other venues. But it is distinct because it is the first Italian architecture, the Italian, what we call an Italian opera house. The way it's built with the with the round features, what we think of when we think of the opera house. In Italy, how is opera funded? Oh, in Italy, it's very government funded. I would say about 92% of the funding comes from the government and mostly the state, but also the communes and the cities contribute as well. And yeah, they're very dependent on government money, which has its positives and negatives.
Right. And there's another one in there, which is, will there be opera in person in Florence in the coming season? What's your thought? Inside view, Deborah.
Well, we're right now in the process of preparing Così fan tutti. And the hope is that it would be for a reduced audience like we did in the fall. But again, we're waiting to hear news on if we can open our doors officially. Right now, no. The answer is right now we cannot.
So wait and see. Maybe we have to wait for the autumn when the vaccination program will hopefully be more advanced. Yeah.
I know that we'll be rehearsing and we'll be preparing either way. So Maggio Musicale and La Scala, where I'm involved, they both do streaming. And a lot of them are doing, a lot of theaters around Italy are providing the streaming for free, which is not something that they normally do.
That's fantastic. So a good opportunity actually to hear those two great opera houses, even if you can't physically be there.
Absolutely.
So,
I will say
in terms of La Scala. Yeah.
I will say that there's nothing like being there, and definitely as a musician, for us, it makes an enormous difference when we have our audience there. You guys are so important to us as musicians, and I believe I can speak on behalf of all musicians. We really, really, really need your energy, and to play for you, it's irreplaceable.
Okay. Now, does anyone have something that they'd like to say? I see 1 or 2 people are unmuted, but maybe that's an accident. I just have, oh, okay, Sarah Baker, yeah?
Hi.
Hello.
Hi from yes, usually in Florence, but right now I'm in Connecticut. I think it was 2 years ago, they did the Eurydice in the grotto at Palazzo Pitti.
Were you able to see it?
I was, oh, it was fantastic. And I think that Maggio Musicale needs to do more early music in the fabulous settings that Florence has to offer.
Certainly. Actually, that production that you saw was done, I believe, by Maggio Musicale. I wasn't personally involved, but they do have a more chamber program, as so to speak, but they should do much more. There's so much that they could do.
They need to do so much more, absolutely.
And of course, listening to that music in the Boboli Gardens, you couldn't get any better than that.
They should do it every summer. It should be like a long running, talk about Firenze now, it should be like a long running thing that a tourist would know that they could come and see this particular kind of production any summer that they came to Florence, during Maggio Musicale. Anyway.
That's a beautiful suggestion. Thank you. I will bring that to my superiors.
Please do. Thank you.
It's actually, I might have an opportunity to put that thought into the right minds as well, because just this morning I was having a conversation with people in the Comune, in the culture department, about how we follow up from these ideas of making Florence a yet better place once we get out of lockdown. So yeah, great idea.
We were able to, we have built a new opera house. For people who have been to Florence in the past, there was a different opera house, and now we have a brand new opera house. And on the very, very top, we're able to do concerts, chamber concerts, but it's outdoor. And we were, I think, the first theater to do a live concert during this pandemic. So that was very courageous.
Right. Okay, so I want to ask Sarah, because in Deborah's lecture, she said that the early Euripides were not really great. They weren't very well received. But to your ears, did it sound good? The music? You have to unmute, Sarah.
Are you asking me?
Yeah, because you were there, you heard it.
Oh my gosh!
Deborah's lecture suggested it wasn't they weren't that great. But
No, I was mentioning that they weren't well received.
okay, I got that.
I actually think they're quite precious. They're both beautiful, but I didn't want to get into the whole Caccini Peri debate, which is very, very interesting. And I have my own musicological research on the subject that we could do a whole lecture just on that. But yeah, they are very, very beautiful, both renditions and worthy attempts, definitely.
Oh, I think they're more accessible than people would believe. Imagining they're very, the music's very, very accessible. I think anybody would like it.
Partly, I wasn't able to get into the discussion tonight, but it's very interesting. Part of why I think that it was not convincing was because it was originally musicata by both Peri and Euridice to be a one piece. And during the leading up to the festivities, they started doing some in-house fighting. You had a lot of hubris going around. And eventually either Caccini stripped his music from the production or he had his music involuntarily stripped. Either way, Peri responded by composing the missing pieces that Caccini had originally provided and then promptly credited the whole work to himself. To which Caccini responded by rushing and printing his version first. So, so I think part of the reason it comes across, or it didn't come across so well at its debut, was because of this in-house fighting. And I can tell you from working in as a working musician, if you don't get along with your musicians or your staff, or et cetera, it comes across. It comes across, and people can perceive it.
Very good. Ari, you've unmuted. Did you want to say something?
Yes, could I just ask, being an opera lover, and that was fantastic, but knowing nothing really properly, just from what you played, the Monteverdi seemed much more modern, like Puccini or Verdi, rather than Purcell and Cavalli, which sounded much older.
More Baroque, yes. In fact, I believe that Puccini, Verdi, specifically these two composers, were very much well-informed of Monteverdi's music. And he was always sort of, the bar was set with him. And they would always look to him and not, unfortunately, Caccini and Peri. He was the person that they would go to try to recreate modern operas. And that's still true today, by the way.
Thank you. We'll have another question if you want in a moment, but it's time for me to put in my weekly plea for any donations that people feel minded to give. To remind you all, in case you haven't forgotten, that the Institute receives absolutely no public funding, so we survive on our wits and the generosity of our supporters. So Sarah will put up the link, and if you are so minded to make a donation, or however big or small you feel like, it'd be most gratefully accepted. End of plea for help. So any more questions in the video? There's one in the chat asking about any contemporary Italian opera composers of note.
Okay, well, I was actually preparing myself for that question. I have something even better. It's an Italian Rome Prize winner. His name is Jonathan Berger. He wrote I don't know if you can actually call it an opera, but it's very much in the spirit of these early opera styles. It's called Leonardo, and it was in in celebration for last year's, what was it, 500 years of Leonardo. By the way, this year is Dante's, one of his, what anniversary is it? Do you know, Simon?
It's the 700th anniversary of the death. Yeah, we're doing quite a lot of Dante programming. Yeah.
So, but for you musicians out there, or if you know any musicians, Florence has launched a composers competition, and it's open to all ages, all nationalities, all over the world. And they're asking for people to send in music based on the Symphony of Paradiso, which I believe is he mentions it in one of the last canti.
Very good. So, any more for any more? Applause from a muted Susie and from Janet. Nice to see you all here. All right, the applause, and thank you, Tessa, also for your applause. The applause, I think, probably signals that it's probably time to wrap up. We've gone well over the hour, and so it just remains for me to thank Deborah very much on behalf of all of us for a fascinating talk, with lots of nice music in there. There was mention of a part 2, so we'll have to look at whether we can do that at some stage. Then ready just to say, see you all next week and have a great night and get your vaccinations when you can. We're a bit behind in Italy, but we're living in hope. Yeah, have a great night. Thank you very much, everybody. Good night.
Cheers. Cheers.
Bye.